Good evening, everyone. There's still plenty of seats, so please do grab one as you come in. My name is Hamad Nasser. I'm the Director of Programs and Content here at Ibraaz. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you and to welcome Translator back. This is the first of a planned series of conversations. We hope 3 series of conversations called the World Overheard. And this is a series around ideas of journalism, of translation, of power. That seems particularly relevant today because we are living through Dickensian times, no? And Dickensian in the sense of the best of times and the worst of times, particularly to be a journalist. And if you wanted to underscore it any further than what we've already been seeing over the last few years, we heard news, of course, yesterday of Ahmed Shahabuddin, the American Kuwaiti journalist who has been detained for comments on social media. Ahmed was a friend of Ibraaz, and this, like so many others, we feel dearly. I'm not going to take more time because we have an incredible array, a roundtable behind me. What I wanted to do was just to thank the teams that have put today and everything behind it together, both here at Ibraaz, and in particular Sarah, Emma, Barney, and all of you here, but also with our wonderful collaborators, Translator. So Frankie, Chame, Daniel, I know who's not here today, but with us in spirit. And finally, but certainly not least, Charles, who will be moderating today. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Charles to introduce today's session and look forward to joining you in the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is the mic working? No. Is it working? Yeah, it's not working. Okay, that's always good. Is it working now? Sorry, I've turned it on. There we go, we'll get to it very soon. There we go, that's magic. So yes, we'll be having a wonderful conversation this evening. Thank you so much for coming. As you see, we have a very wonderful panel, both here in London and also online. See if I can bring them up. That's great. And I'm very, very excited this evening for 3 reasons. The first is, of course, a fantastic panel, and I think we're going to have a wonderful conversation this evening. The second is that this is the first of a series of 3 events which we're doing with Ibraaz, which we're very excited about. And the third is because just earlier today we got the first copies of our Translator's 3rd issue, which is there, which I think looks absolutely fantastic. It's not actually officially out until next week, but we managed to get a few copies today, and if after the event you want to buy a copy, then you can do so at the back. I want to talk a little bit about what Translator is. We're a very, very young publication. We've only existed for a year. This is only issue 3. We started off quite experimentally, and now we're sort of getting into our stride. To explain why we exist, I'm actually going to read something from the inside cover, which I think says it pretty succinctly. In an English language media environment of increasingly narrow editorial lines, reinforced by algorithmic and monolingual bubbles, the manifold media landscapes beyond the Anglosphere are often fetishized or ignored. Diversity is flattened. With your help, we're taking a radically different approach, platforming and translating journalism from around the world. Rather than accepting a narrowing of our perspective, we're building a global community of English language readers engaging with the full diversity of what the world is talking and writing and thinking about. Join us to make a difference. Monolingual media bubbles are the enemy of solidarity. Curiosity is the antidote to apathy. So I hope that's got you excited. It certainly got me excited. And as I said, you can buy a copy of the magazine afterwards. But the inspiration for the event we're doing today actually comes from an article in issue 1 of the magazine, which is here. And I want to talk very briefly about that story. That story is called The Rescue That Never Came. And it is about the situation in the borderlands of Cambodia and China of cyber scam compounds where Chinese and other citizens of other countries are trafficked essentially into modern-day slavery, working in these cyber scam compounds that generate cyber frauds. And it's a really, really powerful piece of writing, a really harrowing investigation by a publication called Initium Media, which is a Chinese language publication, which doesn't operate in mainland China. It operated first in Hong Kong and then now in Singapore. And I think that the story is the story itself is fascinating. But what's important from our perspective is first, that this was a story that was very hard to report in China because of the political relationship between the People's Republic of China and the Cambodian regime. And so it was underreported in the Chinese context and could be reported by what is essentially media in exile, Initium Media. But also it's a story which was underreported or not reported at all for a long while in the Anglophone press. So translating this story was a way of trying to show the wonderful journalism being done in countries and languages beyond the Anglosphere, but also allowing these stories, giving a platform, an additional platform to stories which often don't circulate as they should. And we think this is very important because global journalism matters a great deal, and journalism in exile, newsrooms in exile, has become a growing issue. Hamad referred to the conditions under which journalists are working all around the world, trying to work all around the world. But many, of course, are forced into exile, and this is really an increasing phenomenon. We know the reasons: war, repression, the rise of authoritarian states. We have cases of Russian newspapers operating now in Lithuania. On the panel, we have a representative of an Afghan television channel now operating in connection between, or based in the United States. Global journalism is under threat, as we know, from problems of money, problems of technology, problems of politics, the mechanisms of state repression. And this all really, really matters because journalism is also about power, as has been mentioned before. One question we'll get to in the panel is the relationship between journalism and activism. And many of our panelists have been on both sides of that. I wouldn't say it's a divide, but they've been both journalists and activists at different times. But in a sense, I think one could make the case that journalism itself is always a kind of activism because it is about power, because it is about voice, because it is about holding the powerful to account, and in some sense, therefore, is a response to the possibilities of tyranny. So to discuss this, we have a really quite extraordinary panel. We're very, very fortunate to have them here today, both here physically and virtually. I'm going to briefly give you their names and their short bios, and then we'll get to it. So online, on the left there, you have Alaa Abd el-Fattah, who's a British-Egyptian writer, software developer, former political prisoner for a long time in Egypt, and now a writer. And there's a wonderful book published by Fitzgerald, which you may have seen in the bookshop upstairs, and I recommend you buy a copy of it. You have not yet been defeated. We have Ricardo Avelar, who is a Salvadorian journalist and editor covering democratic backsliding in El Salvador, a former political editor of El Diario de Hoy. Please excuse my poor Spanish accent, and living in London since 2023. We have Lotfullah Najafizada, who is the founder and CEO of Amu TV, broadcasting to Afghan audiences at home and in the diaspora. We have Vanessa Tsehaye to my left. I hope I got your surname correct. Okay, you're very forgiving, thank you. Very close, okay, that's good. A Swedish Eritrean journalist, filmmaker, and human rights campaigner. We have Negin Shiraghaei, an Iranian-British feminist political activist and former BBC Persian TV news anchor. And Galileo Cheng, who I'm glad to see is showing a little bit of his fantastic T-shirt, which I hope you'll be able to get a chance to see later, who's a freelance investigative journalist and researcher from Hong Kong, but now working in the UK. To get us all started, what I want to start with a question to everyone on the panel. and maybe I'll start over here with Negin. But I'm going to ask the same question to everyone. Is very succinctly, can you tell me, give us a brief sense of what the situation is for media freedom and open civic discourse in your quote-unquote home country?
Non-existent. So basically, there is no communication right now in Iran. What the government has done, and that has been a trend all over years. I left Iran in 2008, towards the end of 2008, to come and work for BBC Persian. I was a journalist back in Iran. And since then, we've seen waves and waves of journalists leaving the country to be able to report on the country from outside because of the arrest. We had one journalist who was lured back in and executed. So in recent years, especially in the last 2 years, we've seen a lot of internet shutdown and communication shutdown. So there are incidents and days that people cannot even call each other. So in that environment, reporting on what's happening is really difficult. But also we have really brave journalists still inside the country who's been reporting on Iran. So Women Life Freedom started with those reporting in the mainstream media inside Iran. So it's a really complex situation, but thankfully we still have those brave journalists.
Absolutely. Galileo, what's the situation in Hong Kong?
Okay. So when I talk about these T-shirts, these are made by one of the designers of the media got shut down in Hong Kong almost 5 years ago, called Stand News. So when you look into your Facebook timeline, every news article you can see, every news article in the timeline has been disappeared because they have to shut down the Facebook or the social presence. So what you can see in the timeline is this content is not available in the timeline. But strangely, after 5 years, I would say the Hong Kong situation is improving. Even though the RSF Press Freedom Index, we're in the almost bottom, we're in 140th. So because I'm out of the country for quite a few years, so I asked some of the journalists who I still work with to talk with me what it is like. So they say, yes, the space is quite poor, it's quite limited, but it's not that worse. So they still have an agency even facing difficulties. They still try to do investigative stories. So you may see from the news that last year we have a huge fire, 7 blocks of building engulfed in flames, and now we have a investigation committee going on, but that's the investigative committee without prosecution power, so they're just investigating. And people, myself and some of my colleagues are doing their best to dig into all the details of why these kind of things, like imagine 7 Grenfell Tower caught into flame, happening in Hong Kong, 2,000 flats totally lost. So why this happens? So people are still trying to do their best to do, but we do have some journalists being tailed by some unknown people. And our former Journalists Association chair was not banned. He was shadow banned to work in every single media in Hong Kong, nor even trying to book a football field to play football. So I would say the most important issue is we don't have the funding because of the economy situation. People are afraid of donating, and that kind of thing. So strangely, we don't have any arrests right now.
Well, it's also interesting to know when you're saying that the very many different ways in which journalism can be repressed through economic means, through political means, through technological means, which may not be directed. Let me turn actually now to Alaa. What's the situation in Egypt? You've only just recently left Egypt. What's the situation there for media freedom and civic discourse?
Well, the all like private investment in media has mostly been acquired by actually security-run companies. So there are no mainstream outlets that are independent of a security apparatus anymore. The few independent outlets that exist are blocked in the country, but strangely allowed to operate as like formally recognized news outlets, and sometimes they can actually have access to sources within the government and so on, but they're also constantly under threat. And have to appear before the prosecutor on every couple of months. So they are being intimidated to limit what they say, and also blocked to limit the distribution of their output. And of course, the citizen media and the social media seen this as more wild and uncontrolled. And so what we have is also a constant attempt to control people's expression. This isn't typically around news in particular. It can also be around just expressing sexual identities, or I'm threatening family values. So people are prosecuted and people are getting arrested every day. Just today, they arrested a TikToker who is a woman who is a bodybuilder, and she's challenging the body image of the feminine body image, and so then this is actually what she's being accused of, humiliating the image of Egyptian women or something strange like that. So there's a constant threat of incarceration and actual incarceration happening, as well as ownership and control of the.
And we had a fascinating conversation yesterday, Alaa, which also involved talking about sort of flooding the zone, this playbook of people being distracted by social media or by the churning out of various narratives that would turn people's attention away from what was really happening. Is that something that you see?
So like the media that they control already, but also there's like troll farms and accounts, but also the official newspapers and TV stations and so on have very active social media pages and so on. They're flooding with their playing from the same playbook as that's been described as flooding the zone with shit. So there's constant barrage of very sensational stories that are not about anything in particular, or stories that are reported about crimes and so on, but they would be exaggerated and our conspiracy theories and so on. So there's a lot of actual real investigative journalism being done, also analysis and serious opinion and so on, but it's almost like nobody is paying attention to it.
The cut through is hard to achieve. Yes.
Yeah, it's like you're stuck. You can't find the right language to speak in such an environment. How do you engage people with stories that are complicated, that require a lot of explaining, that involve numbers and
Can I turn to you, Lotfullah? What's the situation like in Afghanistan? You're operating regularly with reporters also in Afghanistan, with people in Afghanistan. How do you see the situation there of media freedom and civic discourse?
Well, not good. If it was any good, I was not going to speak. If it was any good, I was not going to speak on a panel about Exile media, right?
Exactly. Yes. Indeed.
From North America. I mean, the sad thing in our case is that we had the freest media in the entire region just 5 years ago. And now, as our friend from Hong Kong said, we are at the bottom of World Press Freedom Index. And that is because of a very brutal authoritarian regime in Afghanistan, the Taliban. And in Afghanistan, it's also a struggle, a very profound one, between sort of thousands of journalists who believe in free flow of information and the Taliban trying to conquer and take over that space. And that battle is not won yet in our case. It is work in progress on both fronts, from the Taliban trying to take over local media, outlaw hybrid exile media, put more pressure on them, and the journalists and the civic space, trying to ensure that the Taliban is not successful in radicalizing and Talibanizing the entire nation, particularly as probably the youngest country outside sub-Saharan Africa with the youngest population. The median age is only 18, two-thirds under 25. So we embraced democracy for 20 years. An entire generation grew up with it, with press freedom being at the center. And now, so there's a very fast process of, undoing it and sort of a rollback. It's a struggle. I mean, it's not, there's sort of a very sad story.
I think we're getting a very strong sense of the different mechanisms of repression and distraction which can exist and which can prevent media from flourishing, perhaps in the way journalism and writing from flourishing and being playing the political activist role that we might like or consider to be quote unquote normal or expected or ideal, certainly ideal. I'd like to turn now to Vanessa. How do you see things in Eritrea?
Well, Eritrea is one of the few countries in the world where any independent media is completely banned. So we haven't had any media outside of the state since 2001. And it's interesting, obviously, hearing themes from the different countries. And obviously, a lot of these countries are outside of the West, but it resonates with Western countries too, where national security is kind of used as a smokescreen to shut down independent voices. And what we had in 2001 was a conflict that had just ended with Ethiopia that was officially ended, but there was still tension between the countries. And so the government was like, until that is resolved, we can't have any kind of issues happening internally. We have to be strong, we have to be united, and therefore we have to shut down any independent media just temporarily. And that was 25 years ago. So, yeah.
Okay. Ricardo, the situation in El Salvador.
On the 31st of July 2013, a young politician from El Salvador tweeted, "Politics is horrible and corrupt. Imagine if there weren't journalists." Years later, this young politician became the president, and he made it a reality. He got rid of independent free press in El Salvador. So you may have heard of Nayib Bukele, the Salvadoran president. He's also known as the Bitcoin president, or the Bitcoin bro surf fan, who is also incarcerating civil society activists and threatening media, like independent media outlets, and forcing journalists out of the country. What has he done? He has executed a multi-pronged strategy. The first thing he did was he stigmatized media outlets. He portrayed us as the enemies of the people, while also funding a very large propaganda apparatus that includes content creators. He realized that people don't pay attention to long stories, people don't read long articles, and that in 2 seconds, people usually decide if they want to keep watching a video or not. So Nayib Bukele discovered that if he hires a lot of like often vulgar or like plain speaking content creators who speak wonders of himself, it will like flood the zone, as he said. The second strategy was to create administrative threats. So instead of threatening journalists with like incarceration or whatever, he would threaten media outlets with the finance ministry coming to their offices and accusing them of tax fraud or accusing them of money laundering. So that obviously puts pressure not on journalists, but on the owners of media outlets and the publishers. Then he started threatening journalists directly and sending envoys here and there to make you feel scared. People taking pictures of your house, unmarked cards outside your newsroom or unmarked cards outside your office. Then he started funding spyware. So on November 23rd, 2021, I got an email from Apple. Well, the story's a little longer. A young politician sent me a screenshot saying, I got this email. And the email said, state-sponsored attackers are targeting your iPhone. And the first thing I thought, to be honest with you, was, oh God, it sucks to be you, man. 20 minutes later, I got the same email. So, I said, oh, it sucks to be me. So that was the fourth, fifth step. And then the next one was just targeting journalists individually and very openly and brazenly. Last year, there was a group of my colleagues in Costa Rica in an event, and on their way to the airport, coming back to El Salvador, they got a call from a diplomat saying, turn around, don't go back, the police is waiting for you. So, it starts with stigmatizing, and it ends with actual police officers threatening you.
I think that's a very important note also to think about in the context of the United Kingdom or the United States as well, where these are different parts of the journey, if you like. There are so many different aspects to the way in which journalism can be stifled, repressed, outright made illegal, impossible, other means, distraction, etc. And it of course explains why this is a very important subject, but also why many journalists are in exile. But also a note to ourselves in supposedly areas where press freedom is supposed to be more flourishing, in say the UK. Many of these aspects of these stories, we can see also in the way that our own media operates here in the UK. I want to turn to the question of exile. We've seen why media in exile, journalism in exile, writing in exile, activism in exile, why it's important, and how it has to happen in a sense. But I want to talk about this term exile, which I think is a very interesting one, and it's one that some people attach to themselves strongly, and others dislike the term. And I want us to think about that together perhaps a little bit, because exile on the one hand could be described as a sort of legal category, a political category. You can't return to your country, you are in exile, you've been forced out, you're in exile. But it also has this sort of psychological resonances also. And I wanted to ask who on the panel likes the idea of being in exile, not the fact that they may be in exile, but the term, and who sort of shies away from it or is less keen on it. Are there thoughts on the panel about that term itself?
I can start. I think I consider myself a quote unquote like privileged exile, in as much as I came to the UK 3 years ago because my wife, who's in the audience and will hate me for saying this, she's British. So we met years ago, and at some point when I was in El Salvador and she was here, she was like, all right, we need to get you here. I don't want an imprisoned husband. And so I came here with enough time to pack my bags, with enough time to say goodbye to people, but totally unable to go back to my country. So I don't like saying I am in exile, just because there are people who have had it much worse than me, because I grew up reading about people in exile and like people who were like literally had to run across an international border. So it feels strange to say it, but when you realize that you cannot go back to your country, you're like, yeah, there's grace here. So I think I'm privileged in as much as how I left the country, but of course I cannot go back. So it's a gray area.
Lotfullah and Alaa, are there ways that you think about this term? How does this term resonate with you?
Yeah, I actually wanted to respond to this anxiety about using the term because you're privileged. I was, most of the time, a relatively privileged prisoner in certain ways, but I was also, and it took me a very long time to realize that I was also being especially, isolated, and there were many ways in which I was punished in way, more severely than the average prisoner. And so I learned in prisons that to just completely identify with the identity of a prisoner, and not even a political prisoner. I am an ex-con. And so in that sense, I'm also an exile, and I'm legally not a refugee because I have a UK citizenship, but I am an exile. There's no doubts about it, and I think that it helps one embody this space better, to just acknowledge it and accept it, and that this, your privileges that are still there, and you need to be aware of them, but they don't change the very fact that you've been forced to disconnect and to be uprooted, and to find ways to, you're also not an immigrant. You haven't made the decision to go seek better fortunes, or you fell in love with someone and you need to go live with them in this other country. You are in a situation not of your choosing, and you're going to spend the rest of your life trying to deal with this fact. And someday we will return, but even then, I think the alienation of exile is still going to be with us.
Lotfullah, Negin, any others want to come in on that notion of exile?
Yeah, so for me, there's a nuance and there's a difference between someone in exile and a journalist in exile. I think if you're a journalist and you're not allowed to go back to your home country and report on it, you might be able to go back and visit your family and come out. But if you're not doing your job in your home country, you're in exile. You're an exile journalist. And I think that's really important to understand, because for years, for example, these are the patterns that emerges. And we've been having these different conversations. We see the patterns that repeats itself in different contexts over time. So in Iran, when it started, it was, as a journalist, being outside and broadcasting to the country, you could go back. In 2008, when I was leaving the country, I could go out of the Iran, and then I knew I could go back to Iran. But my problem was, if I go back, I have to answer questions. I have to give them information about other journalists, what they're doing outside. I left 2 years later. My family were under pressure inside Iran, so I couldn't go back. But when I was leaving, I was thinking, I'm not going to go back to Iran until I'm sure when I'm going back, I'm not going to report on my colleagues, right? So I was in my self-exile as a journalist. Then it became an exile by the government. But I think that's a really important nuance to understand.
And I think that gets us into the real sort of the meat of of what we want to discuss this evening, I think, which is what happens once exile begins. How does it affect one's ability to tell stories, one's feeling of one's own perspective, and even right sometimes to tell stories? What does it make possible or impossible? Vanessa, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess back to the exile question. So I was born in Sweden, and I'm very upfront about that, and I talk about it a lot because it's very important in any context to kind of, as you talk about, of course, like talking about privilege. But I also think it's important to nuance the idea of like what a dictatorship and exile and activism looks like. And I get this thing when people interview sometimes and they're like, so tell me how it was when you fled. And I'm like, well, I literally was born in Stockholm, as I've told you 3 times. But there's like this desire to have like a really horrible story that happened to me, and then kind of either my accent helps me or it's a disadvantage because they prefer something that's more like sounds more African, whatever that is. These are things that have been told to me explicitly, so I'm not even making crazy assumptions. But to me, this is like a little bit outside of this conversation. I don't necessarily have to bring it in, but I want to bring it in because I think it's difficult for us Eritreans to get our voices heard because our journalists are all imprisoned or all exiled. So we have no one inside of the country who can speak about the issues happening to our people. When things are happening to Eritreans in almost all the countries that they go to across Africa, across Europe, they don't have journalists who are from the country that they're from to rely on to report on those issues, even after they flee. And so our entire movement is outside of the country. Most of us sound like me. Like we've had Eritreans who were born in outside of Eritrea since the 70s, since the 80s, because we had an independence war. A third of our population fled, and we were born in the diaspora. It's usually how we call ourselves, diaspora activists, diaspora Eritreans. And we're also Eritreans, and for all intents and purposes. So I like to bring that in to be like, I'm so privileged. I would never be like, oh, me, exiled Eritrean journalist. Absolutely not. Like, I was born in Sweden, but I'm a representative of the Eritrean community like many other Eritreans are. And I, in particular, my uncle's a journalist. He's been in prison in Eritrea since 2001. That was when the free press was shut down. The same day, they went and rounded up all of the politicians that had been critical of the government, including ministers, including generals, 11 of them. And then the day after, when all of them were taken, they rounded up the journalists, 10 of them, the most high-profile journalist. My uncle was one of them. So my work, I tried to continue the work that my uncle did at the time through my own journalism, through my activism, and through my organization named after him. So that's what the Eritrean situation looks like. But when you try to pitch it to a journalist at a Western organization, they're like, oh, we need pictures from inside the country of a newsroom. But that's just, we don't have that. Like, this is our exiled journalists.
And I think it gets to the many layered difficulties and challenges of being a journalist or a writer in exile. Some of which may be about, in which, first of all, of course, the challenges of perhaps trying to report on the quote unquote home country, but then also to which audience are you speaking? Are you trying to speak to the quote unquote home audience, or can you use your voice to speak to an English language audience for example, or a Swedish language audience, in which case you're subject potentially to this notion of, well, it's got to be framed this way for it to work for this audience. So I can see that being a very... do you want to come back on that?
Was that a question? Sorry.
No, you were just picking up the microphone, so I thought...
I thought it was a question. I thought it was a question about audience, because it's interesting, but I want
well, you can speak about audience if you like.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. I feel like I just gave a lecture on Eritrea. No, it's really interesting because obviously for me, I'm an activist first, and I started doing activism when I was 16. So I always say that anything I've done since is just to like support my activism, which I don't necessarily think is always the best way to develop different like skills. Because I really wanted to speak about like journalism as a craft, as a talent, as a skill, as opposed to just a tool, which I think is really important. But in my case, all these things came later. Like film came later, journalism came later, law came later, campaigning came later. All was to support like activism. And so for me, our journalism and our kind of campaigning was very strategic, and it was to say like, okay, are we trying to mobilize people? Are we trying to inform people? Are we trying to kind of campaign on a specific issue? And so all of our work targets people specifically for what we're trying to do with that specific campaign, if that makes sense. So if we're campaigning, for example, recently campaigning for Eritrean refugees in Egypt, who are we targeting? Not Eritreans inside the country. There's nothing they can do about this. We were targeting people in English, in the diaspora, people in London. There was a protest outside the Egyptian embassy, for example. If we're talking about issues happening inside of the country, then it's both, of course, trying to talk with people inside. But we have a massive diaspora. Like I already said it, but I'm gonna like emphasize that again. Like we've been in exile for a long time. And I say exile because every Eritrean wants to go home. Yeah. And most Eritreans are banned from going home because of their activism, even if they've just attended a protest. And then we also have the people who were born after independence, who have experienced a dictatorship, and who have fled. That's like more than 5,000 people flee every month from Eritrea. We have the largest population of refugees who are not coming from a war-torn, like a country at war. And so when we talk about home and people, it's not, again, confined to the borders of Eritrea. They're everywhere. Most of them are in the region, but they're everywhere. So
I want to turn, if I may, to Lotfullah, because you run this extremely successful television channel. How do you make journalism work in exile for you? How do you do it? You were telling me before about a call-in program that you had, where you get a large number of Afghan callers or people writing in questions, etc. How do you make it work? Do you believe it can work?
Yes, in our case, yes, it does. So we set up a satellite TV channel broadcasting via satellite free-to-air into Afghanistan from North America. And the reception is great. We have this call-in show called The Soul of the Conversation. It was profiled by the BBC and others last month. In just 1 hour, when the show is live, we receive up to 6,000 calls from across Afghanistan. We're not able to talk to 6,000 people, but we talk to like 20, 30 as many as we can. But that is the amount of, I would say, response to just a small, what we call a hybrid TV channel, broadcasting from overseas into the country. It also is a sort of a testament to the culture which is there, that the Afghan people, would like to engage, regardless of how the Taliban like it or not. So if we have a difficult topic, let's say the leader of the Taliban issuing another edict against women, you have more calls. So the harder the topic, the more the calls. And the Taliban's, I think, strategy is to change that culture over time. So it becomes North Korea. Even if you have, no matter how many call-in shows you have, nobody's going to call. But for that, it's very important that our programs like ours continue to exist and operate, give the Afghan people a platform to express their views.
Absolutely. Alaa, I wanted also to turn to you. We had a conversation yesterday about the challenges of writing in exile and the weight of trying to write in exile and giving voice in exile. How have you found that, the process of writing and trying to put pen to paper, etc.?
Yeah. First of all, I just want to say to Vanessa, I'm very sorry about the campaign against refugees in Egypt. It's one of it's and actually this thing that I was talking about, how they're flooding the zone. One of the things they're doing is instigating. It's a government-led campaign that's instigating xenophobia, and then followed by this massive crackdown. It's absolutely horrible, and it's also one of the most challenging things to report on the ground in Egypt, because it's clearly a very dangerous topic to cover. And so we are relying on exiled activists and journalists to cover it, even though the actual data is being collected on the ground. Like the on-the-ground journalism is being done by Egyptians, but the voices that are amplifying this. And part of it is because if you're very strongly identified with supporting refugees, then you might risk being attacked and so on. So there is to respond to your question, there is this strange double motion around Exile. I have just submitted an article to Mada Masr, which is an outlet that is operating in Egypt. The newsroom is in Egypt, and I'm writing from Exile. And I wrote it in response to the arrest of my friend Ahmed Douma, who is writing from Egypt, but sending to an Egyptian outlet that is in Exile, Al-Arabi, which is operating from Istanbul, I think, or London here. I don't remember. So there are moments when local outlets need people to write from outside, and there are moments when people from inside need to write from outside. Ahmed Douma was arrested, so his voice is exiled, but his body wasn't, and so they kidnapped his body again. But the problem is in this double motion is that you need to be very careful about your language all the time. No one is going to question what you publish if you're sending to an outlet that is outside the country, but you are going to face the consequences yourself. In my case, I have to think about the impact of how my words impact other people who are working in the newsroom who might be arrested, but also how it falls on Egyptian ears or Arab ears when the person speaking is speaking from outside and specifically identified with, living in the West during a time of war in which the UK is complicit and so on. So it becomes very complicated and very paralyzing, to be honest. It took the arrest of my friend for me to be able to just break my writer's block and write. But since I arrived in the UK, I'm completely unable to just find the right language to write in Arabic, and I have absolutely no idea how to even begin writing in English. What is the audience? What is the society? What does it want from me? And what can I say to it? And so on.
I think we're getting a very strong sense of the necessity of writing and working journalistically in activism in Exile, and also many of the challenges. I want to come on to one of the sort of most thorny challenges, and one which is a growing problem, which is the issue of transnational repression, where one might assume, or it might be assumed that if you're operating in countries such as the UK, United Kingdom, that it's a pretty safe country and you'll probably be fine. But actually, there are mechanisms of repression, direct and indirect, which can exist in the country where the exile is now based, but also which can have implications on the family, for example, of the journalist or writer or activist. I wonder if maybe Negin or Galileo both would like to talk a little bit about, you've had personal experience of those issues.
So my research and also my work is on targeting disinformation and transnational repression. So of the case here, I was studying in Canada, so a little bit quite privileged because Hong Kong people got to a special pathway in Canada. They can study and work in Canada and they get the permanent residence, although they may have to wait for 10 years or 50 years, I don't know. And for those who has the British passport back in Hong Kong, they can move here, just stay for 5 years and they can apply for permanent residence, so it's quite a privilege. But the thing is, because the community is growing here, we see an internal conflict that those who arrive earlier from Hong Kong and China is very or relatively hostile to the Hong Kong community, or Tibetans or Uyghurs because they align with China. So the thing is, it is hard to balance your report and whether it will feed the information need for the whole Chinese community or just the Hong Kong community or the overall UK community as well. We're still struggling to find a balance of that. And strangely, we don't have much of the oppression or repression from the Hong Kong authority. We just do whatever we like. The thing about TNR or disinformation is, strangely, is from the readers. So sometimes the readers, they have a very strong sentiment. They want to read something. They're not wanting to have like fact-based verification, whatever. They just want something pro-Trump, pro-Israel, whatever. They just want that kind of right-wing rhetorics, which is strangely, I don't know why that happened. That's creating another kind of sentiment and also a dilemma for us to operate in the newsroom, that it creates some kinds we call, aside from a researcher, it's called hostile media phenomenon. So whenever you try to present fact-based reporting, the readers just have the perceived profound ideology, so they see your words as kind of betrayal to what they want to see. So I think that's kind of even worse than TNR or disinformation, because you need extra amount of time trying to debunk that kind of rhetorics. Even though we strive for working on fact-based, like I do something about verification, like all these satellite images, online verification, countering AI deepfakes, targeting the activists, the reader just don't like it. So I think that's even worse than TNL happening here and in Canada.
Well, I mean, that's definitely a global problem. Elements of it are a global problem. But to go back to the question of transnational repression in terms of security and how states or other entities can interfere, Negin.
Yeah, so I've been living under transnational repression for the last 15 years. Basically, it started with putting pressure on my family back in the country, arresting, hacking, luring. It's been on different levels. Iranian in the UK has been facing that for a long time. We had incidents of bombing, attempts bombing, assassinations. It's quite severe. I haven't lived in my house in London for the last year. But I see another thing that is growing as well. So my problem with framing of TNR at the moment, transnational repression, is that we're looking at it from the lens of security. We're talking about China, Iran, Russia, the countries that are quote-unquote enemies, and then we're ignoring completely other countries who are friendly and have the upper hand here to be able to do whatever they want to the journalists here. I know Saudi journalists, I know UAE activists, I know a lot of people from friendly country who's been unbelievably harassed in this country. And then because of the framing of TNR, there's no framework around it. And then there's another aspect to that. That is I as a journalist an activist, so this happened last year, I got a fellowship in the US. It's Trump time, and then I get an email from the State Department, and the fellowship came from the State Department, right, in the US. And I get an email, we chose you, and this is congratulations, come and work with us. And then later on, I got another email, we have this new rule coming in that social media posts will be monitored. And then so we just, let you know that you have to be careful about it. What kind of social media posts? Pro-Gaza posts, pro-Palestinian, if you said anything against Trump, Elon Musk, Netanyahu. So what kind of transnational repression is that? And we're not even putting it in the framing of transnational repression. So I think it's evolving, it's changing, and the world is changing at the same time. But unfortunately, us as journalists, we are losing our freedom of speech. We're self-censoring ourselves for so many years, and I think it's going to get worse.
And what are the actions or mechanisms which can help fight back against transnational repression? What do people see? What should happen? Vanessa.
Well, just to continue on that, because I have been doing this work for like a long time, and I only started hearing the term transnational repression like a few years ago. I guess in like especially in the UK, there's a strong interest, in the US there's a very strong interest. It is, I think, very politicized in some ways. I think the context and what it actually is, which I don't know if everyone is aware of it, but it's basically when activists leave their country and then like beyond the nation, like transnationally oppressed by the government or their supporters. And like in our context, Eritrea is like usually a very good example because, you know, we can't operate inside. So what is transnational oppression in our context? But I was surprised. I was like, what's the point of this? Like, why are they obsessed with like framing and asking so many questions about this like now? Because it's only been in the past 2 years that I've been hearing this term constantly. I think there's a new commission set up by the UK government as well and stuff. So that's interesting. And I think now you spoke about that context, I think there's more to it. In my case, I think transnational oppression, again, is a way for governments to keep track of their citizens or their people outside of their borders. And it works in different ways. I mean, we have worse things of like actual killings that are happening in many different contexts, attacks, threats. And then there's ways that I like to call making your life very difficult so that people don't want to do what you do or you don't want to continue living the life that you're living. And that could be anything from constant harassment, social media, kind of like threats and harassment, just, you know, making life just very hard. And that is hard to prosecute. It's hard to prove. It's hard to identify. It's hard to get tech companies cooperation to identify people who are behind these accounts, even though it would be very easy for them to do so because they require police involvement, but then police don't always look into it in the way that you want them to. So it's hard to stop as individuals. I'm happy, again, that these government initiatives are here to kind of talk about it, but I don't know how much they're doing on an individual level to help people who are kind of becoming victims of this. And I just want to add, because I do think there's a study that was made recently that I was a participant of, where they looked at, they didn't use the terminology, but transnational repression of female activists. And there is a strong kind of bias in who they choose, all of them. And there's a lot of evidence of kind of slut shaming and a lot of like tapes and pictures and stuff that have been leaked of many female activists and journalists from many different countries. So that it really ranges from, you know, any kind of method to just make life as difficult as possible to keep you quiet.
Yeah, we just saw a lot of cases last year that is AI generated deepfake targeting female journalists, and that's strong gendered aspect of TNR.
Ricardo, I sense you want to speak.
No, I just wanted to say that in El Salvador, El Salvador is a very small place. The Salvadoran government doesn't have as much resources as, you know, like the Chinese government to persecute people in person in different places. But there's been one case, and I think it's quite alarming, that bridges the gap between a government or a country where there's no independent judiciary. So they rubber stamp cases against you, and then they send them to Interpol. So Interpol arrested one journalist who in Spain, one Salvadoran journalist who was attending his visa hearing. He was going to seek refuge in Spain, and upon arriving, the Interpol was waiting for him. And it was luckily the judge took time to read about El Salvador, because if you're a judge in Spain, you may be presented a well-built case. She took the time to read about El Salvador, and she realized that this was politically motivated. But I fear that, you know, that sent a chilling message to everyone who had left El Salvador, because suddenly you're far away from your country, but you're still not safe. And it is only a matter of a judge not doing their due diligence and actually believe these bogus cases to actually send you back to El Salvador, where you shouldn't go back because you'll be imprisoned for political reasons. So I think Interpol and I think diplomacy should be more effective, because Interpol is a great tool for authoritarian states to suddenly extend the reach in other countries.
I think we're really getting a sense of the importance of this problem, but also the complexity of it. Alaa, I thought you raised your hand. Am I correct?
Yes.
Good.
Yes. I just wanted to complicate the issue of
Please.
Transnational repression. Yes. So I mean, there is Western repression of voices coming from the global majority, and we've seen this particularly around Palestine. And so,
Yes.
and for Exile writers in particular, this can be very dangerous because your voice is mostly directed back home, and where the context and the norms and the standards are very different. Not to go into details, but to give a very, I think, straightforward example that most people in the room would probably know of. When we choose to use the word Zionist in the Arab world, we are actually signaling that we are not sectarians, that we are not making this a conflict about religion, that we are not against Jewish people. While we are, when you use the word in a Western context, you're being repressed with the idea that now you're being an anti-Semite, because when you say the word Zionist, you're actually, what you mean is hate speech and so on. So so there's been like a chilling effect, but also arrests around this. I would like to hear from our Iranian colleague how complicated it is to speak about the war happening there, given given the complexities of the Iranian diaspora. There could be pressure coming from the diaspora, but also there is also ways in which the West can be complicit in when transnational repression happens. In many cases, it is known to governments that the embassy is monitoring activists and taking actions against them, or and the people who are doing this are known, but no action is taken. People aren't being protected, even if they are citizens of the host country.
Thank you very much. I want to move on now, if we may, to the question of the boundaries between journalism and activism, and whether in fact one can or should have a boundary between those two things. Is it meaningful anymore? Some of you are working, very much as journalists. Others are working more in the activist space, but have been journalists. How do you see where is the line personally, or philosophically, or politically, between journalism and activism? Who would like to take that question?
So strangely, my training when I was back in Hong Kong, I was trained as an advocacy journalist. I was not trained as a traditional journalist because I was working with. I start my own training in a grassroots citizen media, but practically when we try to practice that in the UK or in Canada, is starting to have a central dilemma, because you have to navigate two roles, whether you want to advocate for democracy or you want to provide fact-based reporting, and how you want to build the community. Because as I think, the Hong Kong communities in UK, in Canada, in the States are still in the making. So it's hardly to say Hong Kong people are in diaspora. So in my own research, I just call the Hong Kong media in the UK is overseas Hong Kong media. It's not in exile, it's not in diaspora at all. So we're trying to deal with this tension of trying to, whether we work on underreported issues or sensitive issue in Hong Kong, or we want to focus on more stories about things happening in the UK, in Canada, in the Hong Kong global community. It is more like impact or engagement building, rather than doing advocacy for now, because it is so hard to find, as I say, it's so hard to find a balance to get stories that people want to read, and what kind of information we want to hide not hiding, we try to frame what kind of angles we want to frame it. So rather we shift to more investigative things.
How do others see the balance between activism and journalism? And again, I'm looking at you in particular, yes.
Yeah, because I'm coming from a completely different background. I think you mentioned that you're coming from an activism turning journalist. I'm coming from a journalism background, right? So I didn't study journalism, I studied pure mathematics, but I became a journalist to do journalism. right? And in this older school, you as a journalist, you're the eye of the public. You're monitoring, you're trying to be, standing in the middle and just be the reporter telling people what's happening in their society. And that meant, I'm a bridge. I'm trying to make sure that people have a vision of what's happening around them and put light on anything that is not right. But that's not activism for me. For me, activism means building power for grassroots, building power for people. And advocacy is one little piece of activism. Advocacy is just little awareness thing that might overlap with some things that the journalists do, but it's not the same. So when I was a journalist, and that's actually the reason I left journalism, because when I was a journalist, there was a point that I felt like I'm only putting the microphone in front of power. I'm telling, I'm kind of a mirror for them. Where are people in this? Where's the power for people in this? And that's when I left BBC 8 years ago now, and I started trying to figure out how do we build power for people from the activism perspective. And now, if I say I'm a journalist, I always say I'm an ex-journalist, but people don't accept it. For them, if you're a journalist, you're always a journalist because the way you talk or you put light on the stuff. And now with social media, everyone expects to do that. But I think there is a really red line for me between my journalism and my activism.
I want to turn to Ricardo and Lotfullah on this question, and the notion of as journalists, is there, to what extent does your articles, your stories, or simply the fact of existing allow for the possibility of political change in either El Salvador or in Afghanistan?
Yeah. On the border between activism and journalism, I experienced that because I also started doing activism. I was a political research and advocate at a think tank, and then I started working for a newspaper. And when I started working for a newspaper, I joined this monolithic, huge organization full of very experienced journalists and reporters who had been covering civil wars and stuff like that. And then I came, and I was an advocate before. And this is very traditional newspaper, and I said to them why don't we make videos? Why don't we explain things? What you've had in this country for ages, explainers and short clips and trying to provide context. To many people in the outlet I was working at, that was outrageous because they were like, you're not the story. You shouldn't put your face in it, But at the same time, that would be a disservice to your audiences if you don't put any story in context, and at the end of the day, you'd be doing, what you're saying, just putting your microphone in front of power. But also, I think that line, and that line between activism and journalism, is much easier to understand if you're living in a full democracy. Because then, in a full democracy, fine, stick to your method, stick to whatever they taught you in school. But when there's crippling authoritarianism, and I had these discussions with my colleagues at the paper, old editors. I had these discussions, the president stormed the Congress with the military. And I was like, we need to say this is an authoritarian thing. And one of the editors said, who says that? And I'm like, dude, it's a military there. So I think those lines are much easier to understand if you're living in a full democracy. If you are living, in a crippling authoritarianism or semi-dictatorship or dictatorship, might as well, at least that's how I see it. It may sound irresponsible, and if there are journalism professors in the room, I'm sorry, but I think you are called to do some sort of activism.
I think it's just realism, and I think it's a wake-up call, which is important also in journalism schools. I want to turn to Lotfullah, if I may, briefly, because I want, does the fact of existing, the mere fact of existing, does that play a role in giving you hope that that allows for the possibility of change? It represents possibility. Is that how you see it, or is it the particular stories that you pursue, or the particular articles or programs which you produce, which is most positive from your view, your perspective, in terms of creating a possibility of change in Afghanistan?
I mean, I see it. I try to simplify it for myself, but I think activism and journalism are two different things. You can be both. right? But it's your choice. Look, we are, I mean, especially people like on this panel, I mean, all of us, including myself, in a way, we've become the story ourselves, you know, because of the circumstances in our countries, and now we talk about it. So we're prone to sort of be an activist and advocate for our cause and sort of explain our stories. Probably do more panels than do stories and produce journalistic pieces. So that is, in a way, making it very blurry for us. But if activism is preventing me, let's say in my case, to not produce a balanced story because it requires a right of reply for the Taliban, for instance. I say, oh, because I hate the Taliban, you know, my job is to topple the Taliban. Why I should talk to them? Then I think advocacy and activism is hurting journalism. And that is when I think we have to have a very clear distinction between what activism is and what journalism is. I mean, we produce a lot of positive stories from inside Afghanistan today. It might benefit the Taliban, but I mean, our audience is not just the Taliban. Our audience is like 39 million people in that country who are not the Talib, and they want to know what's happening. You can't just choose, you know, the way you do journalism based on how a particular sort of group of people or a government would perceive it or benefit from or sort of be hurt due to your reporting. But I understand that, you know, in the world that we operate, it's especially in our case, I mean, and all of us from countries represented here, it's very personal as well.
Thank you very much. We are shortly going to turn to the audience, so if you have a burning question which you wish to ask, then please formulate it now, and shortly you will get a chance, hopefully, to ask it. But I want to turn first to Vanessa.
Yeah, this is my favorite question. Well, actually, one of my favorite questions, because I, like in general, not just for this conversation, because obviously, as I said, I am an activist. That's what I identify as first, and everything else comes second. And I think it's important to also talk about what it means to be an activist and to not necessarily frame journalism as this like very natural, like existing completely like on this like unbiased space, and then we have like us crazy activists who are like kill them, like we hate the Taliban or we hate this government or whatever. I think everyone's, I mean, this is so basic, but everyone's biased, and a lot of these institutions are like, I mean, institutionally biased, where they have very strategic goals that are very clear, like explicitly clear. I mean, the New York Times is fighting in this war as strongly as any other think tank or organization in DC at the moment, and that doesn't make them less journalist or less of a newspaper. I think where the distinction must lie, and where I actually am very keen on saying someone is a journalist and someone is an activist, is because journalism is important. Journalism as a institution, around ethics, around professionalism, around fact-based journalism, as you talked about, verification. These are all really important tools that exist within journalism, and you cannot run a newspaper in this country and not have all those things. You will get shut down because there are professionalisms around like how that should be run. Same thing if you're a doctor. You can't just be doing whatever you want, you know, as a doctor, because it's a very specific profession where there are rules. And I think as an Eritrean, where we haven't had independent journalism since 2001, we have one TV channel, one newspaper, one radio channel. We don't have journalism at all. And the state media institutions that exist are not journalistic in any way. We have people who are sat there with pieces of paper that have been given to them, right? And even here, where we have state media channels that are not the best maybe, but they're practicing journalism, and no one can dispute that. What they're doing in Eritrea is not journalism, it's just a complete propaganda channel. And that was in 2001. The only university we have in the country was shut down 2 years later. My uncle actually founded the state television channel in Eritrea in 1991 when we became independent. And he trained the next generation of journalists at that time in the 90s. They fled in the early 2000s right after my uncle was imprisoned. They came here. That was the last batch of trained journalists that we have. That is a massive concern for me, because it means that we don't have trained journalists. What we have are incredible activists. We have YouTubers, TikTokers, who produce interesting and thoughtful and really far-reaching content, but is it journalism? Not according to me. And not to say that that's not important work. I think everything should be done in this context. We need activists, we need TikTokers, we need all of that. But when we don't have pure journalism, even if it's biased, because again, journalism is biased, but it doesn't have those very important components, then we don't have journalism anymore. And just to add, to me, I call myself a journalist and an activist, not to say that I'm different, but I've worked as a journalist. I work at Al Jazeera right now. I've also worked as a campaigner. I used to work at Amnesty International. I have had the same objectives in every institution that I've been at, but I've used different tools according to those professions at those different places at all those times. And I think that's what makes the distinction. I've written op-eds and feature articles about the same issue, but I've written them completely differently, obviously, because that's what requires for anything to be considered either journalism or activism, in my opinion.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. We're going to have to finish up very, very, very soon. I want to ask one very, very brief question to all of the panel by way of conclusion. We've had a very, very serious conversation. It's gone into some very dark places, some very interesting places. I think it's been totally fascinating. I want to ask what messages of hope you may have at the end. What things are you? I hope there's something. Is there anything that you're hopeful about? Seeds of change that you see, or things that you believe are sort of urgent and necessary right now? Who wants to begin?
I can go and then we can go around.
Okay, again.
So for me, there's I do believe hope, and I say it over and over again, especially when I'm building movements, that hope is this light that is coming from a lighthouse in the middle of the ocean. Your ship is wrecked. You're looking for a beach, kind of getting somewhere safe. And then you see the light and you think, oh, okay, that's the direction. And then it's dark. It's really dark. And then you feel lost again. But that light would come back. And as long as you keep that course, you would see the light again. And hopefully at some point you're going to get to the shore. So any small reporting, anything that can put light on important issues, this kind of fringe story that you translated from Iran or Afghanistan, the story of inflation, whatever it is, when I see those little things, it reminds me that journalism is still alive. And to answer your question, I think we need that kind of journalism back, because we are surrounded by noise, and that noise is actually playing in the hand of power that distracts us from the important things that's happening in life. So my hope is those journalists scattered around the world that are reporting on the important issues and they're not giving up.
They're still doing it. Galileo.
So one of the overseas Hong Kong media I'm working with is their motto is try to becoming the light to bright up the pathway to hope. So I think the wave, especially I have the data with myself, so about 60 to 70% of the readers are actually from Hong Kong themselves. So we see the readers wanted to have something fact-based and something who can shed the light to the Hong Kong, China democracy movement in abeyance. So what we are trying to do is to advocate for democracy, do something that the mainstream media in Hong Kong cannot do, or they don't want to do because of the repression, because of these stress from the authority. We just try to fulfilling the ideological commitments and political duties given to becoming a burden to us, that we want to continue working on that pathway until to the point that people were so enlightened and creating like a Habermas public space in digitally.
Ricardo.
To get to hope, I'm going to tell you a really sad story. Before we
That's
get
what
there.
we need.
Shortly before I left El Salvador, when we knew that this was becoming a dictatorship, we used to go to vinyl parties. One of our friends, who's a human rights defender, he's also a DJ, so he used to host vinyl parties, and they were open to the public. But as it got later and later, people started leaving, and at the end of every single party, it was just a group of journalists, activists, human rights offenders. It's like a little club. And every party, they were monthly. Every party, there was one or two less people. So it's like your family photos, so there are members disappearing. So every time the party's getting smaller and smaller, and we knew that there was going to be a point in which none of us were going to be there. None of us are there anymore. But there is, at the end of every single party, my friend played the same song every single time. And it's a song from an Argentine album that came after the dictatorship in Argentina. If you want to play it, the song is called Los Dinosaurios, the Dinosaurs, by Charly Garcia. And the song says, your friends from neighborhood may disappear. The people you read on newspapers may disappear. The person you love may disappear. But one day, the dinosaurs will disappear. So we played that song every single time we went to those parties, and we all hugged and we all cried, and one day we'll sing it again.
That's a great story. Thank you very much indeed. Vanessa.
I think, to be an activist, you have to have hope, because especially when it comes to long-term, like authoritarian or like oppressive societies and governments. So for me as an Eritrean activist, hope is all I have. And my organization that I started, my uncle's name, One Day Siyum, works specifically around campaigning, capacity building, media production, and community work. So we have really taken time. It's been 13 years of working on this organization with over 500, 600 people across the world, and really try to understand what are the challenges, what can we actually work on, and what can we see happen in the coming 5 years, and then after that 10 years, and then 15 years, whatever. And our government has only had one president. We've only ever had one dictator, and he is not going to live forever. So in some ways, there's going to be change, whether that's going to become better or worse, but it's an opportunity for change from our perspective. And then, of course, as I said, our work doesn't just focus on people inside of the country. It's about Eritrean people, wherever they might be, and that includes Eritrean refugees. So a lot of our work with refugees is very effective. It actually usually works. That's actually where I get most of my immediate satisfaction from, is okay, we stopped a plane from deporting people to Eritrea, or we got some people released, or prison conditions improved for these individuals. That's very immediate, but the long-term work, which is very, very, very difficult, and again, very long-term, requires a lot of time and effort that we want to put in and we aim to put in, and we believe will hopefully have an impact. Can I do a very small plug? We have a magazine for our organization. I'm so sorry, this might not be appropriate, but it's, if you want to learn more about Eritrea, it's it has everything you need to know about the country. It's more of a book, I would say. I won't even call it a magazine to tell you guys not to get the other one. But it's basically everything you want to learn about Eritrea, but from a cultural perspective in addition to the political. So it has a very holistic view to show you kind of the breadth of the entire country.
Thank you very much indeed. Lotfullah? Hope. What hope? Give us something hopeful.
Well, I think we should all be very glad that there's literally no country, particularly the authoritarian states, where the flow of information is fully stopped. There are people who produce content. There are information that's out there, and we get it from all sorts of countries. And that's, I think, wonderful. It's on our shoulders, it's our responsibility to sort of work further, enhance it, build on it, and make sure journalism thrives further. So I'm pretty hopeful that in today's world, I think the world in general is way more well-informed and connected.
Alaa, last word, a word of hope, hopefully.
It's very grateful that you get me for last. I'm not in a hopeful space at all, and I believe we live in fundamentally tragic times. So I will suppress that and not talk about it, and talk about exile and take hope from that. I think I've been thinking about some of the writers and the artists who have had the most impact on me and who had the most impact and who have had tremendous impact on the world have worked from exile. And so I do believe that we live in fundamentally tragic times, and I do believe that exile is a fundamentally tragic state. And so it is a good place from which to analyze the world and reflect back on it and give back to the world something. But it's also a good place from which to see the beauty of everyday life, which can be way more difficult to see at home when you are really being crushed by what's happening, and and whether you're able to do it or not. And so I'm thinking of people like Edward Said or Frantz Fanon or Stuart Hall, but I'm sure there are millions of examples of how you can write, observe, reflect, analyze, and produce work from a position of exile that would resonate in ways that we cannot even imagine. Our words are not going to exactly do whatever it is that we intend them to do, but they will be consumed and what's the word? Rerogated, consumed and reproduced by people who have not been born yet, and I take hope in that.
Thank you very much indeed. I think that's a wonderful point to end this evening. I want to say thank you to an absolutely fantastic panel. Please clap and say thanks. It's been a fantastic, really wonderful. Follow them. Please follow them. Please, you have the information on the individual panels. Please follow them, look up their work, follow the organizations they work for, read their stories. I want to say also, of course, thanks very much to Ibraaz. Thank you very much for hosting us this evening and for making this all possible. Thank you very much to our the Translator team. If you want to buy a copy of Translator magazine, you can, and sign up to our newsletter. My colleagues Frankie and Charmi at the back of the room, so please do. You'll find many very interesting stories in there, and hopefully some beginning of an answer to some of the less positive stories we were talking about this evening. Come to the next event we do with Ibraaz. If you're free on the 22nd, we have a Wine and Words event. There's much more that you can learn about that we're doing with Translator. And please sign up to our socials, etc., all the normal stuff. But again, thank you most of all to an absolutely fantastic panel. I think we've all been worried, enriched, inspired. I think mostly inspired. I do feel inspired. The fact that these people are still working in the way that they're working, I think gives me grounds for hope. So please thank them again, and see you next time.